Chapter 21 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Miss Quian's Party. Hurd's sister was a clever young woman who, in her time, had played many parts. She began her career along with Hurd as a private detective, but when her brother joined the official service, Miss Hurd thought she would better her position by appearing on the stage, and therefore took the rather queer name of Aurora Quian. In her detective capacity she had often disguised herself when employed in obtaining evidence, and was remarkably talented in changing her face and figure. This art she used with great success in her new profession, and speedily made her mark as an impersonator of various characters out of novels. As Becky Sharp, as Little Dorrit, she was said to be inimitable, and after playing under several managements, she started, in the phrase of the profession, a show of her own, and rapidly made money. But her great faults, amongst others, were vanity and extravagance, so she was always in need of money, and when chance offered, through her brother, to make any, she was not averse to returning to the spy business. Thus it came about that she watched Mr. Graxton Hay for many a long day and night, and he never suspected the pretty, fluffy, kittenish Miss Quian was in reality an emissary of the law. Consequently, when Aurora asked him to a card party at her rooms, Hay accepted readily enough, although he was not in need of money at the time. Miss Quian occupied a tiny flat on the top of a huge pile of buildings in Kensington, and it was furnished in a gimcrack way, with more show than real value, and with more color than taste. Every room was of a different hue, with furniture and hangings to match. The drawing-room was pink, the dining-room green, her bedroom blue, the entrance hall yellow, and the extra sleeping compartment used by her companion, Miss Stably, was draped in purple. Some wit called the flat the paint box, and indeed so varied were its hues that it was not a bad title to give it. Like the Becky Sharp whom she impersonated with such success, Miss Quian possessed a sheep-dog, not because she needed one, being very well able to look after herself, but because it sounded and looked respectable. Miss Stably, who filled this necessary office, was a dull old lady, who dressed excessively badly, and devoted her life to knitting shawls. What she did with these when completed no one ever knew, but she was always to be found with two large wooden pins rapidly weaving the fabric for some unknown back. She talked very little, and when she did speak it was to agree with her sharp little mistress. To make up for speaking little she ate a great deal, and after dinner, with her eternal knitting in her bony hands and a novel on her lap, was entirely happy. She was one of those neutral-tinted people who seem not good enough for heaven and not sufficiently bad for the other place. Aurora often wondered what would become of Miss Stably when she departed this life, and left her knitting behind her. The old lady herself never gave the matter a thought, but lived a respectable life of knitting and eating and novel reading, with a regular visit to the church on Sunday, where she worshipped without much idea of what the service was about. This sort of person exactly suited Miss Quian, who wanted a sheep-dog who could neither bark nor bite, and who could be silent. These qualifications were possessed by the old lady, and for some years she had trailed through a rather giddy world at Aurora's heels. In her own dull way she was fond of the young woman, but was far from suspecting that Aurora was connected in an underhand manner with the law. That knowledge would indeed have shaken Miss Stably to the soul, as she had a holy dread of the law, and always avoided the police court column when she read the newspapers. This was the old lady who sat in the pink drawing-room to play propriety for Miss Quian. Lord George Sandal was present, looking rather washed out, but as gentlemanly as ever. Hay, with his fixed eyeglass and eternally cold smile, was there, and a third young man who adored Miss Quian, thinking her to be merely an actress, simpered across the card table at his goddess. The four were playing a game which involved the gaining and losing of much money, and they had been engaged for about an hour. Miss Stably, having eaten a good dinner and commenced a new shawl, was half dozing in the corner, paying absolutely no attention to the players. "It's a good thing we're hanging on our own hooks in this game," said Miss Quian, who smoked a dainty cigarette. "Were I your partner, Sandal," she always addressed her friends in this free and easy fashion, "I'd be losing money. What luck you have!" "I never do seem to win," lamented Lord George. "Whenever I think I've got a good hand, the thing pans out wrong." "Hay has got all the money," said the simpering admirer who answered to the name of Tempest. "He and you, Miss Quian, are the winners." "I've made very little," she replied. "Hay's raking in the dollars hand over fist." "Lucky in love, unlucky at cards," said Hay, who did not like his good fortune to be commented upon, for reasons which Miss Quian knew. "It's the reverse with me. I'm lucky at cards." "And lucky in love, too," interrupted Aurora, with a grimace, "seeing that you're going to marry that Krill heiress, if she is an heiress." "What do you mean?" asked Hay, who was dealing a new round. "Go on with the game and don't ask questions," said Miss Quian, in a saucy manner. "Sandal, don't stare round, but keep your eye on the cards." And she winked stealthily at the young lord, while Hay was exchanging a word with Tempest. The young man, who had spoken privately to her immediately before the dinner, knew well what she meant. Had Hay been likewise in the know, he would scarcely have done what he did do, and which Sandal saw him do in a few minutes. Hay was rapidly dealing, and the cards were flying like leaves. A pile of gold stood beside Hay's elbow, and some silver near Tempest. The game commenced, and soon the players were engrossed, heedless of the patent snoring of Miss Stably, who, poor old thing, had succumbed to the lateness of the hour. Suddenly Lord George, who had been very vigilant, felt his foot touched under the table by Miss Quian. He rose at once and snatched up the gold standing near Hay. "What's that for?" demanded Hay, angrily. "You're cheating," said Sandal, "and I don't play with you any more." "That's a lie. I did not cheat." "Yes, you did," cried Miss Quian, bending forward and seizing the cards. "We've been watching you, Tempest." "I saw it all right," said the other. "You took up that king." "And it's marked," said Aurora. "I believe Hay's got cards up his sleeve. Examine the cards." Hay, very pale, but still keeping his countenance, tried to object, but the two young men seized and held him, while Miss Quian, with the dexterity acquired in detective circles, rapidly searched his pockets. "Here's another pack," she cried, and shook an ace and two kings out of the detected swindler's sleeve. "And these cards." Sandal took one and went to the lamp. "Marked, by Jove!" he cried, but with a stronger oath. "Here's a pin prick." "You are mistaken," began Hay, quite pale. "No," said Tempest, coolly, "we're not. Miss Quian told us you cheated, and we laid a trap for you. You've been trying this double card and marked card dodge several times this very evening." "And he tried it lots of times before," said Aurora, quickly. "I have been at several places where Hay scooped the pool, and it was all cheating." "If it was," said Hay, with quivering lips, "why didn't you denounce me then and there?" "Because I denounce you now," she said. "You're cooked, my man. These boys will see that the matter is made public." "By Jove, yes," cried Sandal, with a look of abhorrence at Hay. "And I'll prosecute you to get back those thousands you won off me." "I never did." "You've been rooking this boy for months," cried Miss Quian. "Here, Tempest, get a constable. We'll give him in charge for swindling." "No, no," cried Hay, his nerve giving way under the threatened exposure. "You'll have your money back, Sandal, I swear." "Lord George to you now, you blackguard, and how can you pay me the money when I know you haven't got a cent?" "He intends to get it from the heiress," sniggered Aurora. "Oh, dear me," rose the plaintive voice of the sheep dog. "What is it, Aurora? Anything wrong?" "We've caught Hay cheating, that's all, and the police." "Oh, Aurora, don't bring up the police." "No, don't," said Hay, who was now trembling. "I'll do whatever you like. Don't show me up. I'm going to be married soon." "No, you shan't marry," cried Tempest, sharply. "I'll see this girl myself and save her from you." "You can't prove that I cheated," said Hay, desperately. "Yes, we can," said George. "I and Miss Qian and Tempest all saw you cheat, and Miss Qian has the marked cards." "But don't expose me. I " Hay broke down and turned away with a look of despair on his face. He cursed himself inwardly for having ventured to cheat when things, by the marriage with Maud Krill, would have soon been all right for him. "Miss Qian," he cried in a tone of agony, "give me another chance." Aurora, playing her own game, of which the two young men were ignorant, appeared to repent. She beckoned to Miss Stably. "Take Mr. Hay into the dining room," she said, "and I'll see what I can do. But you try and bolt, Hay, and the news will be all over the West End to morrow." "I'll stop," said Hay, whose face was colorless, and, without another word, he followed the sheep dog into the dining room in an agony of mind better imagined than described. Then Miss Qian turned her attention to her guests. "See here, boys," she said frankly, "this is a dirty business, and I don't want to be mixed up with it." "But Hay should be exposed," insisted Sandal. "He's been rooking me, I do believe, for months." "Serve you jolly well right," said Aurora, heartlessly. "I warned you again and again against him. But if there's a row, where do I come in?" "It won't hurt you," said Tempest, eagerly. "Oh, won't it? Gambling in my flat, and all the rest of it. You boys may think me free and easy, but I'm straight. No one can say a word against me. I'm not going to be made out an adventuress and a bad woman for the sake of that swindler Hay. So you boys will just hold your tongues." "No," said Sandal. "My money." "Oh, bother your money. One would think you were a Jew. I'll see that Hay pays it back. He's going to marry this Krill girl, and she's able to supply the cash." "But the girl shouldn't be allowed to marry Hay," said Tempest. "Don't you burn your fingers with other people's fire," said Aurora, sharply. "The girl's in love with him, and will marry him in spite of everything. But I don't care a cent for that. It's myself I'm thinking of. If I get your money back, Sandal, will you hold your tongue?" Lord George, thinking of what his noble father would say were he involved in a card scandal connected with an actress, thought it just as well to agree. "Yes," he said hesitatingly, "I'll not say a word if you get the money back. But don't you let Hay speak to me again in public, or I'll kick him." "That's your affair and his," said Aurora, delighted at having gained her point. "But you hold your tongue. And you, Tempest?" "I'll not say a word either," said the young man with a shrug, "though I don't see why you should save this blackguard's reputation. It's my own I'm thinking of, so don't you make any mistakes. And now I have both your promises." "Yes," said Sandal and Tempest, thinking it best to hush the matter up. "But Hay?" "I'll see to him. You two boys clear out and go home to bed." "But we can't leave you alone with Hay," said Tempest. "I'll not be alone with him," cried the little woman, imperiously. "My companion is with me." "What do you mean?" "He might do you some harm." "Oh, might he? You take me for a considerable idiot, I suppose. You get along, boys, and leave me to fix things up." Both young men protested again, but Aurora, anxious for her conversation with Hay, bundled them out of the flat and banged the door to, when she heard them whistling below for a hansom. Then she went to the dining room. "You come along to the dining room," she said to Hay. "Miss Stably, stop here." "I haven't got my shawl," bleated the old lady. "Oh, bother." Aurora ran to the other room and snatched up the shawl, and saw Miss Stably sitting down to knit while she led Hay back into the drawing room. He looked round when he entered. "Where are they?" he asked, sitting down. "Gone, but it's all right. I've made them promise not to say." Grexon Hay didn't let her finish. He fell on his knees and kissed her hand. His face was perfectly white, but his eyes were full of gratitude as he babbled his thanks. No one could have accused him of being cold then. But Miss Qian did not approve of this emotion, natural though it was. "Here, get up," she said, snatching her hand away. "I've got to speak straight to you. I've done a heap for you. Now you've got to do a heap for me." "Anything, anything," said Hay, whose face was recovering its normal color. "You have saved me, you have." "As much of a thing you are to save. You'll be cheating again in a week or so." "No," cried Hay, emphatically. "I swear I'll not touch a card again. I'll marry Maud and turn respectable. Oh, what a lesson I've had. You are sure those fellows won't speak?" "No, that's all right. You can go on swindling as before, only," Miss Qian raised a finger, "you'll have to pay Sandal back some cash." "I'll do that. Maud will lend me the money. Does he want all?" "Oh, a couple of thousand will shut his mouth. I'll not see you left. It's all right, so sit up and don't shake there like a jelly." "You're very kind to me," said Hay, faintly. "Don't you make any mistake. So far as I'm concerned, you might stick in the mud forever. I helped you because I want you to help me. I'm in want of money." "I'll give you some." "Picked from that girl's pockets," said Aurora, dryly. "No, thank you. It might dirty my fingers." "Listen. There's a reward offered for the discovery of the murderer of Aaron Norman. I want to get that £1,000, and you can help me too." Hay started to his feet with amazement. Of all the requests she was likely to make, he never thought it would be such a one. "Aaron Norman's murder," he said. "What do you know of that?" "Very little, but you know a lot." "I don't. I swear I don't." "Pish," said Miss Qian, imperiously. "Remember, I've got the whip hand, my boy. Just you tell me how Mrs. Krill came to strangle the—" "Mrs. Krill?" Hay turned white again, and his eyeglass fell. "She had nothing to do with the matter, I swear." "Strikes me you swear too much, Mr. Hay. What about that opal brooch you stole from Beecot when he had the smash?" "I didn't steal it. I never saw it at the time of the accident." "Then you got that boy Tray to steal it." "I know nothing about the boy. Besides, why should I steal that Opal Serpent brooch?" "You wanted to buy it from Beecot, anyhow." Hay looked puzzled. "Yes, for a lady." "Mrs. Krill?" "I admit that Mrs. Krill wanted it. She had associations connected with that brooch." "I know," interrupted Aurora, glancing at the clock. "Don't waste time in talking of Lady Rachel Sandal's death." "How do you know about that?" stammered Hay, completely nonplussed. "I know a mighty lot of things. I may as well tell you," added Miss Qian, coolly, "since you daren't split, that I've got a lot to do with the secret detective service business. I'm helping another to hunt out evidence for this case, and I guess you know a lot." The man quailed. He knew that he did not stand well with the police, and dreaded what this little fluffy woman should do. Aurora read his thoughts. "Yes," she said, "we know a heap about you at the Scotland Yard office, and if you don't tell me all you know, I'll make things hot for you. This cheating tonight is only one thing. I know you are a man on the market, Mr. Hay." "What do you wish to hear?" asked Hay, collapsing. "All about Mrs. Krill's connection with this murder." "She has nothing to do with it. Really she hasn't. Aaron Norman was her husband right enough, and he ran away from her over 20 years ago. But who told Mrs. Krill about him?" "I did," confessed Hay, volubly, and seeing it was best for him to make a clean breast of it. "I met the Krills 3 years ago when I was in Bournemouth. They lived in Christchurch, you know." "Yes, hotel keepers. Well, what then?" "I fell in love with Maud, and went to Christchurch to stop at the Red Pig. She loved me, and in a year we became engaged. But I had no money to marry her, and she had none either. Then Mrs. Krill told me of her husband and of the death of Lady Rachel." "Murder or suicide?" "Suicide," Mrs. Krill said. replied Hay, frankly. "She told me also about the opal brooch and described it. I met Beecot by chance and greeted him as an old school fellow. He took me to his attic and to my surprise showed me the opal brooch. I wanted to buy it for Mrs. Krill, but Beecot would not sell it. When next I met him, he told me that Aaron Norman had fainted when he saw the brooch. I thought this odd, and informed Mrs. Krill. She described the man to me, and especially said that he had but one eye. I went with Beecot to the Gwynn Street shop, and a single glance told me that Aaron Norman was Lemuel Krill. I told his wife, and she wanted to come up at once, but I knew that Aaron was reported rich, which I had heard through Posh, and as he was my lawyer, I suggested that the Krills should go and see him." "Which they did before the murder?" "Yes. Posh was astonished, and when he heard that Mrs. Krill was the real wife, he saw that Aaron Norman, as he called himself, had committed bigamy, and that Sylvia—" "Yes, you needn't say it," said Miss Qian, angrily. "She's worth a dozen of that girl you are going to marry. But why did you pretend to meet Mrs. Krill and her daughter for the first time at Posh's?" "To blind Beecot. We were standing at the door when the two came out, and I pretended to see them for the first time. Then I told Beecot that I had been introduced to Maud at Posh's office. He's a clever chap, Beecot, and being engaged to Sylvia Norman, I thought he might find out too much." "About the murder?" Hay rose and looked solemn. "I swear I know nothing of that," he said decidedly, "and the Krills were as astonished as I when they heard of the death. They were going to see him by Posh's advice, and Mrs. Krill was going to prosecute him for bigamy unless he allowed her a good income. Death put an end to all that, so she made up the story of seeing the handbills, and then, of course, the will gave the money to Maud, who was engaged to me." "The will, or what was called a will, gave the money to Sylvia," said Aurora, emphatically. "But this brooch, you didn't take it?" "No, I swear I didn't. Mrs. Krill wanted it, but I never knew it was of any particular importance. Certainly I would never have risked robbing Beecot, and I never told that boy Tray to rob him either." "Then who took the brooch?" "I can't say. I have told you all I know." Said Aurora, just like her brother. "That will do tonight. But if I ask you any more questions you'll have to answer. So now you can go. By the way, I suppose the brooch made you stick to Beecot." "Yes," said Hay, frankly. "He was of no use to me. But while he had the brooch, I stuck to him to get it for Mrs. Krill." "Queer," said Aurora. "I wonder why she wanted it so much." But this question Hay was unable to answer. Chapter 22 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Further evidence. After all, Hurd did not send Jessop to town as he threatened to do. Evidently the captain had told him all he knew, and appeared to be innocent of Krill's death. But, in spite of his apparent frankness, the detective had an idea that something was being kept back, and what that something might be he determined to find out. However, his thoughts were turned in another direction by a note from Beecot addressed to him at the Red Pig, asking him to come at once to the Jubileetown laundry. "I believe we have discovered the person who stole the opal brooch from me," wrote Paul, "and Deborah has made a discovery connected with Norman which may prove to be of service." Wondering what the discovery might be, and wondering also who had taken the brooch, Hurd arranged that Jessop and Hokar should remain at Christchurch under the eyes of two plainclothes officials. These managed their duties so dexterously that Matilda Junk was far from guessing what was going on. Moreover, she informed the detective, who she thought was a commercial gent, that she intended to pay a visit to her sister, Mrs. Tawsey, and demanded the address, which Hurd gave readily enough. He thought that if Matilda knew anything, such as the absence of Mrs. Krill from the hotel during the early part of July, Deborah might induce her to talk freely. Hokar had proved a difficult subject. Whether he was too grateful to Mrs. Krill to speak out, or whether he really did not understand what was asked of him, he certainly showed a talent for holding his tongue. However, Hurd saw well enough that the man was afraid of the Sahib's law, and when matters came to a crisis, would try and prove his innocence even at the cost of implicating others. Therefore, with an easy mind, the detective left these two witnesses being watched at Christchurch, and repaired to town, where Aurora informed him of the interview with Hay. Billy approved of the way in which his sister had managed matters. "I guessed that Hay was the man who put Mrs. Krill on the track of her husband," he said with satisfaction, "but I wasn't quite sure how he spotted the man." "Oh, the One Eye identified him," said Aurora, who was eating chocolate as usual, and Norman's fainting at the sight of the brooch confirmed Hay's belief as to who he was. "I wonder he didn't make a bargain with Norman on his own." Hurd shook his head. "It wouldn't have paid so well," said he, wisely. "Norman would have parted with only a small sum, whereas this murder will bring Hay a clear 5,000 a year when he marries the girl. Hay acted cleverly enough." "But I tell you Hay has nothing to do with the murder." "That may be so, though I don't trust him. But Mrs. Krill might have strangled her husband so as to get the money." "What makes you think she did?" asked Aurora, doubtfully. "Well, you see, from what Jessop says, Mrs. Krill is devotedly attached to Maud, and she may have been anxious to revenge her daughter on Krill. He acted like a brute and fastened the child's lips together, so Mrs. Krill treated him in the same way." Said Miss Qian, reflectively. "But can you prove that Mrs. Krill was in town on the night of the murder?" "That's what I'm going to find out," said Hurd. "All you have to do is to keep your eyes on Hay." "Oh, he won't cut, if that's what you mean. He thinks everything is square now that I've got those boys to stop chattering. He'll marry Maud and annex the money." "He may marry Maud," said Hurd, emphatically, "but he certainly won't get the 5,000 a year. Miss Norman will." "Hold on," cried Aurora, shrewdly. "Maud may not be Lemuel Krill's child, or she may have been born before Krill married the mother, but in any case Sylvia Norman isn't the child of a legal marriage. Krill certainly committed bigamy, so his daughter Sylvia can't inherit." "Well," said Hurd, "I can't say. I'll see Pash about the matter. After all, the will left the money to my daughter, and that Sylvia is, beyond doubt, whatever Maud may be. And I say, Aurora, just you go down to Stowley in Buckinghamshire. I haven't time to look into matters there myself." "What do you want me to do there?" "Find out all about the life of Mrs. Krill before she married Krill and came to Christchurch. She's the daughter of a farmer. You'll find the name in this." Hurd passed along a copy of the marriage certificate which Mrs. Krill had given to Pash. "Anne Tyler is her maiden name. Find out what you can. She was married to Krill at Beechill, Bucks." Miss Qian took the copy of the certificate and departed, grumbling at the amount of work she had to do to earn her share of the reward. Hurd, on his part, took the underground train to Liverpool Street Station, and then travelled to Jubilee Town. He arrived there at 12 o'clock and was greeted by Paul. "I've been watching for you all morning," said Beecot, who looked flushed and eager. "Sylvia and I have made such a discovery." Hurd nodded good humouredly as he entered the house and shook hands with the girl. "Miss Norman has been doing some detective business on her own account," he said, smiling. "Hello, who's this?" He made this remark because Mrs. Purr, sitting in a corner of the room with red eyes, rose and dropped a curtsy. "I'm called to tell you what I do tell on my Bible oath," said Mrs. Purr, with fervor. Mrs. Purr can give some valuable evidence," said Paul, quickly. "Oh, can she? Then I'll hear what she has to say later. First, I must clear the ground by telling you and Miss Norman what I have discovered at Christchurch." So Mrs. Purr, rather unwillingly, for she felt the importance of her position, was bundled out of the room, and Hurd sat down to relate his late adventures. This he did clearly and slowly, and was interrupted frequently by exclamations of astonishment from his two hearers. "So there," said the detective, when finishing, "you have the beginning of the end." "Then you think that Mrs. Krill killed her husband?" asked Paul, dubiously. "I can't say for certain," was the cautious reply, "but I think so, on the face of the evidence which you have heard. What do you say?" "Don't say anything," said Sylvia, before Paul could reply. "Mr. Hurd had better read this paper. It was found by Deborah in an old box belonging to my father, which was brought from Gwynne Street." She gave the detective several sheets of blue foolscap, pinned together and closely written in the shaky handwriting of Aaron Norman. Hurd looked at it rather dubiously. "What is it?" he asked. "The paper referred to in that unfinished scrap of writing which was discovered behind the safe," explained Paul. "Norman evidently wrote it out and placed it in his pocket, where he forgot it. Deborah found it in an old coat she discovered in a box of clothes brought from Gwynne Street. They were Norman's clothes and his box, and should have been left behind." "Debby won't hear of that," said Sylvia, laughing. "She says Mrs. Krill has got quite enough, and she took all she could." "What's all this writing about?" asked Hurd, turning over the closely written sheets. "To save time, you had better give me a précis of the matter. Is it important?" "Very, I should say," responded Paul, emphatically. "It contains an account of Norman's life from the time he left Christchurch." Hurd's eyes brightened. "I'll read it at my leisure, but at the present moment you might say what you can." "Well, you know a good deal of it," said Paul, who did the talking at a sign from Sylvia. "It seems that Norman, we'd better stick to the old name, left Christchurch because he is afraid of being accused of murdering Lady Rachel." "Was she really murdered?" "Norman doesn't say. He swears he knows nothing about the matter. The first intimation he had was when Jessop came down with the news after blundering into the wrong bedroom. But he hints that Mrs. Krill killed her." "Can he prove that?" "No, he can't give any proof, or at all events he doesn't. He declares that when his wife and daughter—" "Oh, does he call Maud his daughter?" "Yes, we can talk of that later," said Paul, impatiently. "Well, then, Norman says he went fairly mad. Jessop had bolted, but Norman knew he would not give the alarm, since he might be accused himself of killing Lady Rachel. Maud, who had seen the body, wanted to run out and call the neighbors." "How old does Norman say she was?" "About 15, quite old enough to make things unpleasant." "Then she can't inherit the money," said Hurd, decisively. "No," cried Beecot, quickly, "both Sylvia and I think so. But to go on with Norman's confession. He would not let Maud go. She began to scream, and he feared lest she should alarm the neighbors. He tied a handkerchief across her lips, but she got free and again began to scream. Then he cruelly fastened her lips together with the opal brooch." "Where did he get that, if innocent?" "He declared that he spied it on the floor of the sitting room near his wife's feet, and then hints that she strangled Lady Rachel to get it and turn it into money, as she was desperately in need of cash for Maud. Mrs. Krill idolized the child." "I know that," snapped Hurd. "Go on." "When Norman fastened the child's lips together, Mrs. Krill threw herself at him in a rage. He knocked her insensible, and then ran away. He walked through the night until at dawn he came to a distant railway station. There he took a ticket and went to London. He concealed himself until there was no chance of his being discovered, and besides, saw the verdict of the jury in the newspapers. But he was determined he would not go back to his wife, because she threatened him." "In what way?" "Ah," said Paul, while Sylvia shuddered. "In a strange way. When he fastened the child's lips together, Mrs. Krill said that she would do the same to him one day, and with the same brooch." Hurd uttered an exclamation. "So that was why she wanted the brooch so much," he exclaimed eagerly. "Yes, and she told Hay she wanted it, though she did not reveal her reason. She said if she got the brooch he would be allowed to marry Maud, with whom Hay was deeply in love. Hay stumbled across me by accident, and I happened to have the brooch. The rest you know." "No," said Hurd, "I don't know how the brooch came into the possession of Mrs. Krill again, to use in the cruel way she threatened." "Well," said Sylvia, quickly, "we aren't sure if Mrs. Krill did get the brooch." "The evidence is against her," said Hurd. "Remember the threat." "Yes, but wait till you hear Mrs. Purr," said Paul. "But just a moment, Hurd. You must learn how Norman laid the foundations of his fortune." "Ah, I forgot. Well?" And the detective settled himself to listen further. "He was hard up and almost starving for a long time after he came to London," explained Paul. "Then he got a post in a second hand bookshop kept by a man named Gardner, in the Minories. He had a daughter, Lillian." "My mother," put in Sylvia, softly. "Yes," went on Beecot, quickly, "and this girl, being lonely, fell in love with Norman, as he now called himself. He wasn't an attractive man with his one eye, so it is hard to say how Miss Garner came to love him, but she married him in the end. You'll find everything explained at length in the paper we gave you. Then old Garner died, and Lillian inherited a considerable sum of money, together with the stock. Her husband removed the books to Gwynne Street and started business. But with the money he began to trade in jewels, and you know how he got on." "That's all plain enough," said Hurd, putting the confession of Norman into his pocket. "I suppose the man dreaded lest his first wife should turn up." "Yes, and that's why he fainted when he saw the brooch, not knowing that Jessop had removed it from Maud's mouth and pawned it." "I'm not so sure of that," said Hurd, quickly. "Bart overheard him talking of Stowley and the pawnbroker there." "Well," said Paul, with a shrug, "he says nothing about it in the confession. Perhaps he did trace the brooch to the Stowley shop, but if so, I wonder he did not get it, seeing he wanted it. But when he saw it in my possession, he thought I might know of Mrs. Krill and might put her on the track. Hence his fainting. Later he learned how I became possessed of it and tried to buy it. Then came the accident, and I really believed for a time that Hay had stolen it." "Aurora says he swore he did not." "And he didn't," said Paul, going to the door. "Mrs. Purr?" "You don't mean to say that old woman prigged it?" asked Hurd. "No, but she warned me against that boy Tray on the day Deborah was married. Later I asked her what she meant, and she then told me that she had learned from Tray's grandmother, a drunken old thief, how the boy brought home the opal brooch, and—" Here Mrs. Purr, who had entered and was dropping curtsies to the majesty of the law, as represented by Hurd, thought an undue advantage was being taken of her position. She wished to talk herself, and interrupted Paul in a shrill voice. "Granny Clump she is," said Mrs. Purr, folding her hands under her apron. "Tray's grandmother as is name is Tray Clump. I swear on my Bible oath, a wicked old woman as is famous for drink." "I've heard of her," said the detective, remembering. "She's been up heaps of times." "And grows no better," wailed Mrs. Purr, biliously, for she had been strengthening herself for the interview with frequent libations of gin. "Oh, what a thing strong drink is, sir. But Granny Clump, being ill with the lungs, and me being helpful in such cases, having been a nurse when young, and I won't deceive you by denying, called on me to be a good Samaritan. And I was, though she swore awful, saying she wanted gin and jellies, and could have had them if that limb, so did she name Tray, gentlemen both, had only handed to her the rich brooch he brought home just before he went to earn a decent living at the law office, which his name is Posh. "Ah," said Hurd, thoughtfully, "I'll see the boy." "You can see him now," said Beecot, unexpectedly. "When I learned this from Mrs. Purr, and knew you were coming, I sent a message to Posh's office for the boy. He came up quite unsuspectingly, but he refused to speak. I shut him up in a back room, and Deborah has been watching him. And the language of that blessed limb!" exclaimed Mrs. Purr, raising her hands. "Bring him in," said Hurd. "Miss Norman, if the boy uses bad language, you needn't stay." Sylvia, having heard what Tray could do in this way, needed no further hint. She left the room gladly, and told Deborah to bring along her prisoner. Shortly the noise of kicking and strong language was heard coming nearer, and Deborah, with a red face and a firm mouth, appeared at the door, holding aloft a small boy who was black in the face with rage. "There," said Deborah, flinging Tray in a heap at the detective's feet. "If me and Bart have such a brat, I hope he dies in his cradle, instead of growing to a gallows thief in the use of words which makes me shudder, let alone my pretty. Ugh!" She shook her fist at Tray. "You old Bailey viper, though young at that." "Here," said Tray, rising, much dishevelled, but with a white face, "let me go. I'll have the law on you." "I'll attend to that, my lad," said Hurd, dryly. "Now then, where did you get that brooch?" "Shan't tell," snapped the boy, and put his tongue out. Hurd gave him a smack with an open hand on the side of his face, and Master Clump began to blubber. "Assaulting me! Oh, won't you catch it!" he raged in his puny wrath. "My master's a law cove, and he'll have you up before the beak." "You answer my question," said Hurd, sternly, "or you'll get another clout. You know who I am well enough. Make a clean breast of it, you imp, or I'll lock you up." "If I made a clean breast, will you let me cut?" asked Tray, beginning to whimper, but with a cunning gleam in his eyes. "I'll see when I know what you have to say." Tray looked around the room to see if there was any way of escape, but Paul guarded the closed windows, and Deborah, itching to box his ears, stood before the door. Before him was the stern-faced detective with whom Tray knew well enough he dare not trifle. Under these circumstances he made the best of a bad job, and told what he knew, although he interpolated his threats all the time. "What do you want with me?" he demanded, sulkily. "Where did you find that brooch?" "I prigged it from Mr. Beecot's pocket when he was smashed." "Did Mr. Hay tell you to steal it?" "No, he didn't." "Then how did you know the brooch was in my pocket?" asked Paul. "I was dodging round the shop," snapped Tray, "and I heard Mr. Norman and Mr. Beecot a talking of the brooch. Mr. Beecot said he had the brooch in his pocket." "Yes, I certainly did," said Paul, remembering the conversation. "Well, when the smash come, I dodged in and prigged it. 'Twas easy enough," grinned Tray, "for I felt in his breast pocket and collared it. I wanted to guv it to the old man, thinking he'd pay for it, as he said he would. But after the smash I went home to Gran and hid the brooch. When I was a looking at it at night, I saw her and looking at it, and she grabbed it. I cut away with my own property, not wishing to be robbed by the old gal." "What did you do then?" Tray wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "I heard that Mr. Norman was dead." "Yes, and you told Jessop so in the office. How did you know?" "'Cause I went to the shop in the morning to sell the brooch to the old man. He was a goner, so I cut to Mr. Posh, who was his lawyer, and said I'd sell him the brooch." "What?" cried Hurd, rising. "You gave the brooch to Mr. Pash?" "Yes. He said he'd give me up for stealing, and wouldn't give me even a bob for it. But he said I'd be his new office boy. I thought I'd be respectable, so I went. And now," ended Master Clump in a sullen manner, "you knows all, and I ain't done nothing, so I'm off." Deborah caught him by the tail of his jacket as he made a dart at the door and swung him into the middle of the room. Hurd laid hands on him. "You come along with me," he said. "I'll confront you with Pash." Tray gave a howl of terror. "He'll kill me," he shouted, "as he killed the old cove. Yes, he did it. Pash did it," and he howled again. Chapter 23 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. Recording is in the public domain. What Pash Said. In a smoking compartment, which the three had to themselves, Hurd resumed his examination of Tray. They were now on their way to Liverpool Street, and thence the detective intended to convey the boy to Pash's office in Chancery Lane. Paul sat in one corner, much excited over the turn events had taken. He began to think that the assassin of Aaron Norman would be found after all. More, he believed that Sylvia would yet inherit the 5,000 a year she was entitled to, morally if not legally. Hurd, in another corner, pulled Tray roughly towards him and shook his finger in the lad's face. The boy was sulky and defiant, yet there was a trace of fear in his eyes, and the reason of this Hurd wished to learn. "You're a young liar," said Hurd, emphatically, "and not a clever one either. Do you think to play the fool with me?" "I told you all straight," grumbled Tray. "No, you haven't. Anyone can see that you've made a mistake. I leave it to Mr. Beecot yonder." "I was about to draw your attention to the mistake," said Paul. "You mean the discrepancy in time?" Master Clump started and became more sulky than ever. He cast down his cunning eyes and shuffled with his feet, while Hurd lectured him. "You know well enough," said the detective, sharply, "that the brooch was boned by you on the very evening when the murder took place. It was then that Mr. Beecot met with his accident. Therefore you could not have given the brooch to Mr. Pash the next morning, as it had been used on the previous night." "Shan't say anything more," retorted Tray, defiantly. "Oh, won't you?" cried Hurd, ironically. "We'll see about that. You told that lie about the time to account for your knowing of the murder before anyone else did." "No," said Tray, decidedly. "I did go to the shop in the morning." "That you may have done, but not to sell the brooch. Mr. Pash had taken it from you on the previous night." "He didn't," denied the boy. "Then in that case you've told a lie. Pash never had the brooch, and has nothing to do with the murder." "He did prig the brooch from me, and he did kill the old cove." "Well, we'll see what Mr. Pash will say when you accuse him," said Hurd, "but I don't believe one word of it. It's my opinion that you gave that brooch to a third party on the same evening as you stole it. Now then, who did you give it to?" "Mr. Pash," persisted Tray. "On the same evening?" There was no reply to this. Tray set his lips firmly and refused to speak. Hurd shook an admonitory finger again. "You can't play fast and loose with me, my lad," he said grimly. "If you didn't part with that brooch, you must be mixed up in the crime yourself. Perhaps you pinned that poor wretch's mouth together. It's just the sort of cruel thing a young Cain like you would do." "I didn't," said Master Clump, doggedly. "You take me to master, and I'll tell him what I tells you. He's the one." Hurd shook the boy to make him talk more, but Tray simply threw himself on the floor of the carriage and howled. The detective therefore picked him up and flung him into a corner. "You stop there, you little ruffian," he said, seriously annoyed at the boy's recalcitrance. "We'll speak again when we are in Mr. Pash's office." So Tray curled up on the cushion, looked savagely at the detective, and held his tongue. "What do you think will be the end of all this?" asked Paul, when Master Clump was thus disposed of. "Lord knows," replied Hurd, wiping his face. "I never had a harder case to deal with. I thought Hay had a hand in it, but it seems he hadn't. Bad lot as he is, asking your pardon, Mr. Beecot, since you're his friend." "That I am not," disclaimed Beecot, emphatically. "There's a young lawyer I know, Ford is his name. I went to see him as to what chances Sylvia had of getting the money. He was at school with me, and remembered Hay. He said that Hay was dismissed from Torrington School for stealing." "Didn't you know that yourself?" "No. I had left the school. I was ill at home with scarlet fever. But Hay apparently always had been a bad lot. He and that Krill pair are well matched, for I believe the mother is bad, even if the daughter, Maud, isn't. By the way, her age?" Hurd nodded. "I believe she was 15 at the time of the death of Lady Rachel. If so, she can't be legitimate, or maybe not be the daughter of Aaron Norman. However, I asked my sister to look up Mrs. Krill's past life in Stowley, where she comes from." "But she wasn't married to Krill at Stowley." "No, but she lived there as Anne Tyler. From the certificate she was married to Krill at a small parish church 20 miles from Stowley, so Aurora will go there. But I want her to stop at Stowley first and learn all she can about Anne Tyler." "Beechill's the name of the parish in which she was married to Krill before she came to Christchurch," said Paul, musingly. "So I expect they lived there. Miss Qian might search also for the certificate of Maud Krill's birth." "I told her to, and failing that, she's to search in Christchurch. We must get the certificate of birth somehow." "Hurd," said Paul, rather diffidently, "I hope you won't be annoyed, but I have already asked my friend Ford to give notice to Pash to produce the certificate." "Well," replied the detective, "you might have told me, but no great harm is done. What does Pash say?" "I don't know. Ford has not let me know yet. Here we are." This remark was caused by the stopping of the train at Liverpool Street Station. A number of people were returning from their employment in the city to the country, and the platforms were crowded. Hurd grasped Master Clump by the arm and marched him along. But in the confusion of finding his ticket at the barrier, he happened to let go, almost without thinking. In a moment Tray had darted through the barrier and was lost in the crowd. Hurd sprang after him and left Paul to explain. He hurriedly did so, and then went out to see if the detective had caught the boy. Hurd was nowhere to be seen, neither was Tray. The crowd was increasingly thick, and Beecot was at a loss what to do. After waiting for an hour without finding the pair, he thought he would go to Pash's office. It might be that Hurd, having caught Tray, would take him there at once, leaving Beecot to follow. So Paul got on to the Metropolitan Railway and alighted at the Temple station. Thence he walked up to the office in Chancery Lane. "Where's Tray?" asked Paul of the one clerk in the outer room, who was writing for dear life. "I don't know, sir," said the clerk. "He went out this morning and hasn't been back all day. Mr. Pash is very angry with him." Apparently Hurd had not caught the boy yet, or if he had, did not intend to bring him to the office. "Can I see Mr. Pash?" asked Paul, thinking he might as well make some use of his time. The clerk inquired if the solicitor would see Beecot, and presently ushered him into the inner room, where Pash sat looking more like a monkey than ever. He did not appear at all pleased to see the young man, and sucked in his cheek with a crabbed air. "Well, Mr. Beecot, what can I do for you?" he snarled. "You might be civil in the first place," said Paul quietly, taking a chair. "You haven't behaved well to Miss Norman and me." "Oh," said Posh coolly, "have you come to reproach me with that?" "I never waste time," rejoined Paul, equally coolly. "I'll leave you to your conscience." Posh shrugged his shoulders and put his feet on the rungs of his chair. "I think my conscience can stand that," he said. "It's business, Mr. Beecot, business. By the way, I have received a request from Mr. Ford of Cheapside to produce the certificate of birth of Miss Krill. What is the meaning of that?" "I think you know very well, Mr. Posh." "I profess my ignorance," said Posh, ironically, although he looked uneasy and was apparently lying. "In that case you had better wait until you hear from Mr. Ford." "Are you employing Mr. Ford, may I ask?" Paul nodded. "On behalf of Miss Norman," he said coldly. "Ah," sneered the monkey, "you think you'll get the money?" "Wait till you hear from Mr. Ford," retorted Paul again, and enjoyed the baffled expression on Mr. Posh's wrinkled face. "By the way, sir, why did you not tell Hurd that Tray gave you the opal brooch?" Posh turned all the colors of the rainbow. "Does that brat I took into my office out of charity dare to say that he did?" "He does, and what is more, Mr. Hurd is bringing him here to make the statement face to face with you. I am determined to get to the bottom of this case, sir, for Miss Norman's sake, and the possession of the brooch forms an important link." "How so?" "The person who had that brooch on the evening of the 6th of July murdered Norman," said Paul calmly. Posh jumped up and chattered like a baboon in a rage. "Do you mean to accuse me?" he demanded. "Take care, take care." "I don't accuse you. Tray does." "It's a lie, a lie." "Don't excite yourself, Mr. Posh. You'll need all your wits to convince Hurd. Tray accuses you, and Hurd suspects you. I have nothing to do with the matter." "You put Hurd up to this," formed Posh, hardly able to speak. "Pardon me. Hurd is working for the reward offered by your client. Don't you think it was rather foolish of her to offer such a large reward, Mr. Posh, even though she did so to avert suspicion?" The solicitor changed color again. "I don't understand you." Paul shrugged his shoulders and rose to go. "Perhaps Mr. Hurd will explain," he said, and made for the door. Posh, with his monkey face much perplexed, sat hunched in his chair, biting his fingers. As Paul laid his hand on the knob, he called him back. "I can explain," he said nervously. "Not to me," said Paul coldly. "I prefer to do so to you," said the lawyer hurriedly. "Why to me particularly?" "Because I don't think I have acted very well towards Miss Norman, and, as you are to marry her, you may be able to arrange—" "To make peace, I suppose you mean," burst out Beecot. "No, Mr. Posh, you have acted like a scoundrel. You left that poor girl in the lurch as soon as you found that Miss Krill was, as you thought, legally entitled to the money." "What do you mean by hinting she isn't?" "Because you know very well what her age is," retorted Paul. "This matter will be shifted to the bottom, Mr. Posh, by my friend Ford, and if things are as I think they are, Miss Krill won't keep that money. You know very well." "Miss Norman won't get the money either," snarled Posh. "I know that very well. Leastways," he added, "without my assistance." "More of your crooked ways," said Paul indignantly. "Tell what you like to Hurd. I refuse to listen." As he spoke he opened the door and found himself facing Hurd, who was red and hot. The detective stepped into the office, and as he passed Paul whispered, "Hold your tongue about the boy." Then he turned to Mr. Posh. "Well, sir," he puffed, "I have had a job catching up Mr. Beecot. No doubt you know why I have come?" "No," said Posh dryly. "I don't see Tray." "Tray will keep. I've got him safe under lock and key. Before bringing you face to face with him, I thought it best to give you an opportunity of clearing yourself." "Of what?" asked Posh, in a brazen manner. Hurd looked at Beecot, who spoke. "Mr. Posh knows very well that Tray accused him of the crime," he said. "I told him so, and he professed his readiness to explain to you." "Ah," said Hurd. "Shut the door, Mr. Beecot. No need to let all London know the truth." "I don't know it," said Pash, as Paul closed the door and returned to his seat. "Very good," rejoined the detective calmly. "We'll assume for the sake of argument that you did not strangle Norman." "That I certainly did not." "Then you know who did. Come, sir." Hurd became stern. "This boy Tray says he gave the opal brooch to you, and I believe he did. You would not have taken him into your office, a boy off the streets, and with a bad character at that, unless you wanted to bribe him to hold his tongue." "I had no need to bribe," said Pash, gnawing his finger nails and rather cowed by this direct attack. "The boy did show me the opal brooch, and I took it from him to return to Norman." "When did you receive it?" asked Hurd, pulling out his book. "Be careful, Mr. Pash. I'll take down what you say." "I have nothing to conceal," said Pash, in quite an unnecessarily injured manner. "I had employed the boy on several errands, and he knew I was Norman's lawyer. On the evening of the 6th of July." "And the evening of the murder," said Hurd. "Are you sure?" "I'll take my oath on it. The boy told me that Mr. Beecot had met with an accident, and that a blue velvet case containing a brooch had fallen out of his pocket." "It was stolen," said Beecot, hastily. "Tray was not such a fool as to tell me that," replied the lawyer, dryly. "He said that he picked the case up out of the mud, and took it home to his garret. His grandmother, who is a notorious thief, wanted to get it and pawn it for drink, but Tray ran away with it, and came to me about 5 o'clock. He gave me the brooch and asked me to take charge of it, as he expected to get money from Aaron Norman, who wanted it." "Tray overheard my conversation with Norman," said Paul, angrily, "and knew the brooch was mine, and so did you, Mr. Pash." "Well," said the solicitor, coolly, "what of that? Norman was my client, and wanted the brooch. I intended to keep it, and then see you, so that a sale might be arranged." "Norman spoke to me about the brooch several times, and wanted it for reasons you may not know." "Oh, yes, we know," said Hurd, sardonically. "We know much more than you give us credit for, Mr. Pash. Well, you saw Norman about the jewel later that evening. I suppose you intend to tell us you gave him the brooch then?" "I intend to tell nothing of the sort," retorted Pash, after a few moments' thought. "I see that things are coming to a crisis, and I would like to see Miss Norman reinstated in her rights." "Oh," said Paul, indignantly. "And you did your best to give the money to Maud Krill." "Because I believe she was legally entitled to it," explained Pash, lamely. "But since no," he broke off, "I'll say nothing just now. I alone can put the matter right, and I refuse to do so unless I have Miss Norman's promise that I shall keep the business." Paul would have refused then and there, but Hurd, more astute, interrupted his angry speech. "We'll see about that later, Mr. Pash," he said, soothingly. "Meanwhile, what did you do with the brooch?" "I laid it on the table there. The case was open, as I had been looking at it. I sent Tray out of the room and attended to my usual business. Several clients came and went, and I forgot about the Opal Serpent. Then I went to see my clerk outside about a deed. I was with him for some minutes, when I recollected the brooch before I went home, for I intended to take it with me." "Stop," interrupted Hurd. "You were here till Aaron Norman came along with the jewels. So you must have missed the brooch before he came, or you would have taken it, seeing it was exposed on the table." "My esteemed client did not come till 7," said Pash, annoyed at being detected in trickery. "He walked about with the bag of jewels for some time, not being able to make up his mind to give them to me, which he did for safe keeping." "Then he expected a visit from his wife?" "I can't say," said the solicitor, with an air of fatigue. "He certainly hinted that he wanted the jewels placed away safely in case someone connected with the opal brooch should come." "Perhaps Captain Jessop, "Who did come?" said Paul, suddenly. "He didn't mention the name of Jessop," snapped Pash. "Had he hinted at a sailor, I would have known who my nautical visitor was." "We know all about that," said Hurd, waving his hand. "But if Norman came to see you at 7, how did you manage to prevent him meeting his wife in this office?" "Oh, she was " "What do you mean?" asked Pash, breaking off, and conscious that he was letting something slip, something he had rather had not been known. Hurd saw the slip and Pash's confusion, and at once made every use of the opportunity. In fact, he played a game of bluff. Shaking his finger, he approached the little lawyer. "Do you think I come here unprepared?" he asked solemnly. "Do you think I have not been to the Red Pig at Christchurch, and learned that Mrs. Krill knew of her husband's whereabouts through Hay, long before the day she came to you with the lying story about the handbills? Hay has confessed his share in the business of a false introduction to throw Mr. Beecot off the scent, seeing that he was defending Miss Norman's interest. Do you think I don't know that this woman Krill came to see you through Hay, whose lawyer you are?" "She was here on that fatal evening," said Hurd, making a bold shot. "How did you prevent her seeing Norman?" Pash was completely thrown off his balance by this volley of language and presumption of knowledge. "Mrs. Krill left at 6, he gasped, backing to the wall. "And carried off the brooch?" "I'm not sure. I can't say. I did miss the brooch." "After Mrs. Krill left?" "No, when Norman came. I intended to show him the brooch, and found it gone." "Mrs. Krill left at 6. Between 6 and 7 did any other client come to the office?" "Yes. No. I can't say. Well." Pash broke down in despair, seeing that his lies were not believed. "I think Mrs. Krill did steal the brooch." "Quite so, and murdered her husband." Hurd went to the door and took Beecot's arm. "I only hope you won't be brought up as an accessory before the fact, Mr. Pash." And disregarding the lawyer's exclamations, he dragged Paul outside. In Chancery Lane he spoke. "I've bluffed him fine," he said. "That boy is lost. Can't see him anywhere. But we're getting at the truth at last." Chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Krill at bay. Next day Hurd did not go to see Mrs. Krill as he had intended, but spent his time in hunting for the missing boy. Tray, however, was not to be found. Being a gutter snipe and accustomed to dealing with the police, he was thoroughly well able to look after himself, and doubtless had concealed himself in some low den where the officers of the law would not think of searching for him. However, the fact remained that, in spite of the detective's search, he could not be caught, and the authorities were much vexed. To unravel the case completely, Tray was a necessary witness, especially as, even when examined at Jubilee Town, Hurd shrewdly suspected he had not confessed all the truth. However, what could be done was done, and several plain-clothes detectives were set to search for the missing boy. Pash remained quiet for, at all events, the next 24 hours. Whether he saw Mrs. Krill or not during that time, Hurd did not know, and, truth to say, he cared very little. The lawyer had undoubtedly acted dishonestly, and if the matter were made public, there would be every chance that he would be struck off the rolls. To prevent this, Pash was quite ready to sell Mrs. Krill and anyone else connected with the mystery. Also, he wished to keep the business of Miss Norman, supposing the money, as he hinted, might be the case through his assistance, came back to her, and this might be used as a means to make him speak out. Hurd was now pretty sure that Mrs. Krill was the guilty person. She knew Pash through Hay, argued the detective, while thinking over the case, and undoubtedly came to see him before Norman's death, so that Pash might suggest ways and means of getting the better of the old man by means of the bigamy business. Mrs. Krill was in the Chancery Lane office when the brooch left by Tray was on the table, and Mrs. Krill, anxious to get it, no doubt slipped it into her pocket when Pash was talking to his clerk in the outer room. Then I expect she decided to punish her husband by fastening his lips together as he had done those of her daughter 20 and more years ago. I can't exactly see why she strangled him, mused Hurd, as she could have got the money without proceeding to such an extreme measure. But the man's dead, and she killed him sure enough. Now I'll get a warrant out and arrest her straight away. There's quite enough evidence to justify her being taken in charge. I wonder if she made use of that young devil of a Tray in any way. Well, he rose and stretched himself. I may force her to speak now that she is in a corner. Having made up his mind, Hurd went to work at once, and the next day, late in the afternoon, he was driving in a cab to No. 32A Hunter Street, Kensington, with a warrant in his pocket. He also had with him a letter which he had received from Miss Quian, and written from Beech Hill in Buckinghamshire. Aurora had made good use of her time, and learned a number of facts connected with Mrs. Krill's early life, which Hurd thought would prove of interest to the woman. In one way and another, the case was becoming plain and clear, and the detective made sure that he would gain the reward. The irony of the thing was that Mrs. Krill, with a view to throwing dust in the eyes of the law, had offered a bribe of £1,000 for the discovery of the assassin. She little thought when doing so that she was weaving a rope for her own neck. Hurd had brought a plain-clothes policeman with him, and this man remained outside in a hansom while Hurd rang the bell. In a few minutes the door was opened, and the detective sent up his card. Mrs. Krill proved to be at home, and consented to receive him. So shortly the man found himself in an elegantly furnished drawing-room, bowing before the silent and sedate daughter. "You wish to see my mother," said Maud, with her eternal smile. "She will be down in a few minutes." "I await her convenience," said Hurd, admiring the handsome looks of the young woman, although he plainly saw that she was, as he phrased it, no chicken. After a few words, Miss Krill rang the bell. "I want these things taken away," she said, pointing to a work-basket and some millinery with which she had been engaged when Hurd was announced. "Then I shall leave you to speak to my mother." The detective wondered if she was too fine a lady to remove these things herself, but his surprise ceased when the door opened and no less a person than Matilda Junk appeared. He guessed at once that the landlady of the Red Pig had come up to see her sister and had related details about her visitor. Probably Mrs. Krill guessed that Hurd had been asking questions, and Matilda had been introduced to see if he was the man. He became certain of this when Miss Junk threw up her hands. "The commercial gent!" she exclaimed. "Oh, no," said Maud, smiling smoothly. "This is Mr. Hurd, the detective, who is searching for the assassin of my dear father." "Lor," said Matilda, growing red, "and he's the man as came to ask questions at the hotel. I do call it bold of you, Mr. Policeman." "Well," said Hurd, swinging his hat lazily and looking from one to the other, quite taking in the situation. "You answered very few of my questions, so that is all right." "Why did you go down to Christchurch?" asked Miss Krill. "If I have to find out who killed your father," said Hurd, with an accent on the word father, "it was necessary that I should learn about his past life as Lemuel Krill." "My mother could have informed you, sir." "I guessed as much, and, as Miss Junk would not speak, I have come to question Mrs. Krill. Ah, here she is." Hurd rose and bowed. "I am glad to see you, madam." Mrs. Krill, who was as plump and smiling and smooth-faced and severe as ever, bowed and rubbed her white hands together. At a sign from Maud, Matilda gathered up the fancy work and went out of the room with many backward glances. These were mostly indignant, for she was angry at Hurd's deception. "Do you wish my daughter to stay?" asked Mrs. Krill, smoothly. "That is as she pleases," said the detective. "No, thank you, mother," said Maud, shuddering. "I have heard quite enough of my poor father's terrible death," and she swept out of the drawing room with a gracious smile. "That poor child is so sensitive," sighed Mrs. Krill, taking a seat with her back to the window. Whether this was done to conceal her age, or the expression of her face during a conversation which could not fail to prove trying, Hurd was unable to determine. "I trust, Mr. Hurd, you have come with good news," said the widow. "What would you call good news?" asked the detective dryly. "That you have traced the assassin," she replied coolly. Hurd was amazed at this brazen assurance, and thought that Mrs. Krill must be quite convinced that she had covered up every trail likely to lead to the discovery of her connection with the murder. "I leave you to judge whether I have been successful," he said calmly. "I shall be pleased to hear," was the equally calm reply. But as Mrs. Krill spoke, she glanced towards the gorgeous tapestry curtain at the end of the room, and Hurd fancied he saw it shake. It suddenly occurred to him that Maud was behind. Why should she choose this secret way of listening when she could have remained, it was difficult to say, and he half thought he was mistaken. However, listening openly and secretly did not matter so far as the daughter was concerned, so Hurd addressed himself to Mrs. Krill in a loud and cheerful voice. She composed herself to listen with a bland smile, and apparently was quite ignorant that there was anything wrong. "I was lately down at Christchurch, madam." "So my servant Matilda Junk said." "It was necessary that I should go there to search out your husband's past life. In that past, I fancied, might be found the motive for the commission of the crime." "I could have saved you the journey," said Mrs. Krill, shrugging her plump shoulders. "I can tell you what you wish to know." "In that case I will relate all that I have learned, and perhaps you will correct me if I am wrong." Mrs. Krill bowed, but did not commit herself to speech. For the sake of effect, the detective took out a sheath of notes, but in reality he had the various points of the case at his fingertips. "You will excuse me if I talk on very private matters," he said apologetically, "but as we are alone—" Again Mrs. Krill glanced at the curtain, and thereby confirming Hurd's suspicion of an unseen listener. "You will not mind my being perhaps personal." "Personal?" echoed Mrs. Krill, a keen look coming into her hard eyes, and she stopped rubbing her hands together. "Well, yes," admitted Hurd, with affected reluctance. "I had to look into your past as well as into that of your husband's." Mrs. Krill's eyes grew harder than ever. She scented danger. "My past is a most uninteresting one," she said coldly. "I was born at Stowley in Buckinghamshire, and married Mr. Krill at Beechill, which is just a few miles from that town. He was a traveller in jewellery, but as I did not like his being away from me, I induced him to rent the Red Pig at Christchurch, to which we removed. Then he left me." "On account of Lady Rachel Sandal's murder?" Mrs. Krill controlled herself excellently, although she was startled by this speech, as was evident from the expression of her eyes. "That poor lady committed suicide," she said deliberately. "The jury at the inquest brought in a verdict of suicide." "By a majority of one," added Hurd quickly. There seemed to be a considerable amount of doubt as to the cause of the death. "The death was caused by strangulation," said Mrs. Krill in hard tones. "Since you know all about the matter, you must be aware that I and my daughter had retired after seeing Lady Rachel safe and sound for the night. The death was discovered by a boon companion of my husband's, with whom he was drinking at the time." "I know that. Also, that you came down with your daughter when the alarm was given. I also know that Krill fastened your daughter's lips together with the opal brooch, which was found in the parlor." "Who told you that?" asked Mrs. Krill, agitated. "Jessop, the boon companion you speak of." "Yes," she said, suppressing her agitation with a powerful effort. "Matilda said you had him to dine with you. What else did he say?" she asked with some hesitation. "Much less than I should have liked to know," retorted Hurd, prepared to throw off the mask. "But he told me a great deal which interested me very much. Amongst other things, that Grexon Hay had been engaged to your daughter for 2 years." "Well," asked Mrs. Krill, coolly, "what of that?" "Nothing particular," rejoined Hurd, just as coolly. "Only I wonder you took the trouble to pretend that you met Hay at Pash's office for the first time." "That was some romantic rubbish of my daughter's. There was no reason why we should not have acknowledged Mr. Hay as an old acquaintance." "None in the world that I can see," said Hurd, smoothly. "He told you that Aaron Norman was your husband." "No," said Mrs. Krill, decidedly. "I first heard of my husband by seeing a chance handbill." "Not at all," answered Hurd, just as decidedly. "Hay has confessed." "There was nothing to confess," cried Mrs. Krill, loudly and with emphasis. "Oh, I think so," said the detective, noting that she was losing her temper. "You didn't want it known that you were aware of Norman's identity before his death. Do you deny that?" "I deny everything," gasped Mrs. Krill, her hands trembling. "That's a pity, as I want you to corroborate certain facts connected with Anne Tyler. Do you know the name?" "My maiden name," said the widow, and a look of fear crept into her hard, staring eyes. "How did you come to know of it?" "From the marriage certificate supplied by Pash." "He had no right to give it to you." "He didn't. I possess only a copy, but that copy I sent down in charge of a certain person to Beechill." "This person found that you were married as Anne Tyler to Lemuel Krill in the parish church, 20 miles from your birthplace." Mrs. Krill drew a long breath of relief. "Well," she demanded, defiantly, "is there anything wrong about that?" "No, but this person also made inquiries at Stowley about you. You are the daughter of a farmer." "I mentioned that fact myself." "Yes, but you didn't mention that your mother had been hanged for poisoning your father." Mrs. Krill turned ghastly pale. "No," she said, in a suffocating voice, "such is the case, but can you wonder that I forbore to mention that fact? My daughter knows nothing of that, nor did my husband." "Which husband do you mean, Krill or Jessop?" asked Hurd. Mrs. Krill gasped and rose, swaying. "What do you mean, man?" "This," said the detective, on his feet at once. "This person hunted out the early life of Anne Tyler at Stowley. It was discovered that Anne was the daughter of a woman who had been hanged, and of a man who had been murdered. Also this person found that Anne Tyler married a sailor called Jarvey Jessop some years before she committed bigamy with Lemuel Krill in Beechill Church." "It's a lie!" screamed Mrs. Krill, losing her self-control. "How dare you come here with these falsehoods?" "They are not falsehoods. Anne Tyler, alias Anne Jessop, alias Anne Krill, etc.," retorted Hurd, speaking rapidly and emphasizing his remarks with his finger in his usual fashion when in deadly earnest. "You were married to Jessop in Stowley Church. You bore him a daughter who was christened Maud Jessop in Stowley Church. The person I mentioned sent me copies of the marriage and birth certificates. So your marriage with Lemuel Krill was false, and his second marriage with Lillian Garner is a good one in law." "Which means, Mrs. Jessop," Hurd hurled the word at her as she shrank, "that Sylvia Norman, or Sylvia Krill, as she rightfully is, owns that money which you wrongfully withhold from her. The will gave the 5,000 a year to my daughter. and Sylvia is the only daughter and only child, the legitimate child, mark you, of Lemuel Krill." "Lies, lies, lies!" raged Mrs. Krill, as she may still be called, though rightfully Jessup. "I'll defend the case on my daughter's behalf." "Your daughter certainly," said Hurd, "but not Krill's." "I say yes." "And I say no. She was 15 when Lady Rachel was murdered, as Jessup her father admitted. I knew the man was keeping something back, but I was far from suspecting that it was this early marriage. No wonder the man came to you and had free quarters at the Red Pig. He could have prosecuted you for bigamy, just as you would have prosecuted Krill had you not murdered him." Mrs. Krill gave a yell and her eyes blazed. "You hound!" she shouted. "Do you accuse me of that?" "I do more than accuse you. I arrest you." Hurd produced the warrant. "A man is waiting in the cab. We'll get a four-wheeler, and you'll come along with me to jail, Mrs. Jessup." "You can't prove it, you can't prove it," she panted, "and I shan't go, I shan't, I shan't," and her eyes sought the tapestry. "Miss Jessup can come out," said Hurd coolly, "and as to your not coming, a few policemen will soon put that right." "How dare you insult me and my daughter?" "Come, come," said the detective sternly, "I have had quite enough of this. You offered me £1,000 to learn who killed your so-called husband, Krill. I have earned the reward." "Not 1 shilling shall you have." "Oh, I think so. Miss Sylvia will pay it to me, and you—" "I'm innocent. I never touched the man." "A jury will decide that, Mrs. Jessup." "Krill, my name is Krill." Hurd laughed and turned toward the tapestry. "What do you say, Miss Jessup?" he asked. Seeing that further concealment was at an end, Maud lifted the tapestry, which concealed a small door through which she had silently stolen to listen. She advanced calmly. "I have heard all your conversation with my mother," she declared with flashing eyes, "and not one word of it is true. I am the daughter of Lemuel Krill. You will find that hard to prove in the face of your birth certificate and your mother's marriage to Captain Jessup, your father." "It will all be put right." "Quite so, and Miss Norman will get the money." "That girl, never!" cried Maud, fiercely. She looked very much like her mother at the moment, but the more angry she grew, the calmer became Mrs. Krill, who kept darting anxious glances at her daughter. "And you shan't take my mother away," she cried threateningly. "I don't want to make a scandal in the neighborhood," said Hurd, taking a small whistle from his pocket. "But if I blow this, my man out there will call the nearest policeman, and then—" "There is no need," interrupted Mrs. Krill, who had recovered her self-control. "Maud, come over beside me. On what grounds, Mr. Hurd, do you accuse me of the crime? I was not in town on—" "Oh, yes, you were, Mrs. Jessup. Pash can prove that you were in his office and took the brooch left by Tray from the table. I don't know where you stopped on that night." "At Judson's Hotel, Strand," cried Maud, placing herself beside her mother. "And any one there can prove that my mother and myself were within doors after we came from Terry's Theatre, where we spent the evening. As my father, for Krill was my father, was killed after 12, and we were both in bed in one room before then, your accusation falls to the ground. My mother was with me, and she did not leave the whole evening. Next day we went to Christchurch." Hurd was rather staggered by the positive way in which the young woman spoke, but the facts were too plain for him to hesitate. "I must trouble you to come along with me," he said. "No, don't go." "To put on my cloak and hat," urged Mrs. Krill. "I'll come quietly enough. I don't want a scandal. I am sure when the magistrate hears what I have to say, he will let me go free." "I trust so, but you must not leave the room. Matilda will, no doubt, bring your things." Mrs. Krill touched the electric button of the bell, while Maud walked up and down, deathly white and fuming. "Mr. Hay shall see to this," she said in a cold rage. "Mr. Hay will have quite enough to do to look after himself," said the detective coolly. You had better let your mother go quietly, and I won't say anything to Matilda Junk." "Yes, do, Maud," urged the mother, placing an imploring hand upon her tall daughter's shoulder. "It is better so. Everything will be put right when the magistrate hears my story." "What will you tell him, mother?" asked Maud. "That I am innocent, and that I am, as you are, ignorant of who killed your unfortunate father." Matilda entered the room and heard that Mrs. Krill had to go out on business with Mr. Hurd. On receiving her orders, she departed, and presently returned with the cloak and hat. Mrs. Krill, who was now quite cool, put these on. Hurd could not but admire the brave way in which she faced the terrible situation. Maud seemed to be far more upset, and Hurd wondered if the young woman knew the truth. Mrs. Krill kept soothing her. "It will be all right, my love. Don't excite yourself. It will be all right," she said several times. Miss Junk departed, and Mrs. Krill said that she was ready to depart. Hurd offered her his arm, which she rejected, and walked to the door with a firm step, although her face was rather white. At the door she caught her daughter round the neck and kissed her several times, after which she whispered earnestly in her ear, and then went down the stairs with the detective in attendance. Maud, with white lips and cheeks, but with dry eyes, followed. When her mother was safely in the cab, the plain-clothes policeman alighted, so that Hurd might take his place. Maud came quietly down the steps and seized the detective by the arm. "You have ruined my mother," she said, in a cold, hard tone. "You have robbed me of my money, and of the chance of marrying the man I love. I can't hurt you, but that girl Sylvia, she shall never get one penny. So remember." Hurd shook her off, and stepping into the cab, drove away. Mrs. Krill looked apprehensively at him. "What did Maud say?" she asked. Hurd told her, and Mrs. Krill closed her lips firmly. "Maud is quite right," she said with a strange smile. "Sylvia will never get the money." Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A cruel woman. "Just say your meaning, my pretty queen," said Mrs. Tawsey, as she stood at the sitting-room door and watched Sylvia reading an ill-written letter. "It's 12 now, and I can be back by 5, after long and enjoyable talk with Matilda." "You certainly must go," replied Sylvia, handing back the letter. "I am sure your sister will be glad to see you, Debby." Deborah sniffed and scratched her elbow. "Relatives ain't friends in our family," she said, shaking her head. "Whatever you may say, my dearie sweet, father knocked mother into lunatics after she nagged him to drunk and police cells. 3 brothers I had, and all of 'em that handy with their fists, that they couldn't bear to live in harmony without black eyes and swollen bumps all over them. As to Matilda, she and me never did what you might call hit it off, by reason of her not giving way to me as she should have done, me being the youngest and what you might call the baby of the lot. We ain't seen each other for years, and the meeting will be cold. She'll not have much forgiveness for me being a bride, and she but a lone crosspatch, drat her. Don't quarrel with her, Debby. She has written you a very nice letter, asking you to go down to Mrs. Krill's house in Kensington, and she really wants to see you before she goes back to Christchurch tonight." "Well, I'll go," said Deborah suddenly, "but I don't like leaving you all by your own very self, my sunflower." "I'll be all right, Debby. Paul comes at 4 o'clock, and you'll be back at 5. Sooner if me and Matilda don't hit it off, or if we hit each other, which, knowing her habits, I do expects. But Bart's out to 6, and there won't be any one to look after them as washes, 4 of 'em," added Mrs. Tawsey, rubbing her nose, "and as idle as pork-pines." "Mrs. Purr can look after them." "Look after gin, more like," said Deborah, contemptuously. She's always sucking, sly-like, trying to pretend as it's water, as if the smell didn't give it away, whatever the color may be. And here she is, idling as usual. And I may ask, Mrs. Purr, ma'am," demanded Deborah with great politeness, "what I pays you for in the way of ironing?" But Mrs. Purr was too excited to reply. She brushed past her indignant mistress and faced Sylvia, waving a dirty piece of paper. "Lord, miss," she almost screamed, "you do say as you want to know where that limb tray have got to?" "Yes, yes," said Sylvia, rising. "He escaped from Mr. Hurd, and we want to find him very much." "It's a letter from him," said Mrs. Purr, thrusting the paper into Sylvia's hand. "That's how he writes, not having been to a board school. I don't know. He's in a ken at Lambeth, and ill at that. Wants me to go and see him, but I can't leave the ironing." "Yes, you can," said Deborah suddenly. "This errand is necessary, Mrs. Purr, ma'am, so just put on your bonnet and go to Mr. Hurd, as his office is at Scotland Yard, and take him with you." "Oh, but I couldn't." "You go," advised Mrs. Tawsey. "There's £5 offered for the brat's being found." "£5!" gasped Mrs. Purr, trembling. "Lord, and me having a chance of getting it. I'll go, I'll go. I knows the Yard, having had something to do with them dirty police in my time. Miss Sylvia." "Yes, go, Mrs. Purr, and see Mr. Hurd. He'll give you the £5 if you take him the tray." Sylvia handed back the paper. "Tray seems to be ill." "Ill or well, he shan't lose me those £5 if I have to drag him into the lock up myself," said Mrs. Purr, resolutely. "Where's my bonnet, my shawl, and oh Lord, £5. Them as is good always gets the rewards." And she hurried out, hardly able to walk for excitement. "There's a nice old party for you, Miss Sylvia." "Debby," said the girl thoughtfully, "you take her to the Yard to see Mr. Hurd, and then go to Kensington and speak with your sister." "Well, I'll go, as important it is," said Mrs. Tawsey, rubbing her nose harder than ever. "But I hopes you won't be lone, my poppet dovey." "Oh, no," said Sylvia, kissing her and pushing her towards the door. "I'll look after those 4 women in the wash house, and read this new book I have. Then I must get tea ready for Paul, who comes at 4. The afternoon will pass quite quickly. I'll be back at 5 if I can, and earlier if Matilda ain't what she ought to be," said Mrs. Tawsey, yielding. "So make yourself happy, honey, till you see me smiling again." In another quarter of an hour Mrs. Tawsey, dressed in her bridal gown and bonnet, so as to crush Matilda with the sight of her splendor, walked down the garden path, attended by Mrs. Purr in a snuffy black shawl, and a kind of cobweb on her head, which she called a bonnet. As Deborah was tall and in white, and Mrs. Purr small and in black, they looked a strange pair. Sylvia waved her hand out of the window to Debby, as the faithful creature turned her head for a final look at the young mistress she idolized. The large, rough woman was dog-like in her fidelity. Sylvia, left alone, proceeded to arrange matters. She went to the wash house, which was detached from the cottage, and saw that the 4 women who worked under Deborah were busy. She found them all chattering and washing in a cheerful way. So after a word or two of commendation, she returned to the sitting room. Here she played a game of patience, arranged the tea things, although it was yet early, and finally settled down to one of Mrs. Henry Wood's interesting novels. She was quite alone and enjoyed the solitude. The wash house was so far away, at the end of the yard, that the loud voices of the workers could not be heard. The road before Rose Cottage was not a popular thoroughfare, and it was rarely that anyone passed. Out of the window Sylvia could see a line of raw, red brick villas, and sometimes a spurt of steam, denoting the presence of the railway station. Also she saw the green fields and the sere hedges with the red berries, giving promise of a hard winter. The day was sunny but cold, and there was a feeling of autumnal dampness in the air. Deborah had lighted a fire before she went, that her mistress might be comfortable. So Sylvia sat down before this and read for an hour, frequently stopping to think of Paul, and wonder if he would come at the appointed hour of 4 or earlier. With the warmth and the reading and the dreaming, she fell into a kind of doze, from which she was awakened by a sharp and peremptory knock. Wondering if her lover had unexpectedly arrived, though she did not think he would rap in so decided manner, Sylvia rubbed the sleep out of her pretty eyes and hurried to the door. On the step she came face to face with Miss Maud Krill. "Do you know me, Miss Norman?" asked Maud, who was smiling and suave, though rather white in the face. "Yes, you came with your mother to Gwynne Street," replied Sylvia, wondering why she had been honored with a visit. "Quite so. May I have a few minutes of conversation with you?" "Certainly." Sylvia saw no reason to deny this request, although she did not like Miss Krill. But it struck her that something might be learned from that young woman relative to the murder, and thought she would have something to tell Paul about when he arrived. "Will you walk in, please?" and she threw open the sitting room door. "Are you quite alone?" asked Maud, entering and seating herself in the chair near the fire. "Quite," answered Sylvia, stiffly, and wondering why the question was asked. "That is, the 4 washerwomen are in the place at the back, but Mrs. Tawsey went to your house to see her sister." "She arrived before I left," said Maud, coolly. "I saw them quarrelling in a most friendly way. Where is Mr. Beecot?" "I expect him later." "And Bart Tawsey, who married your nurse?" "He is absent on his rounds." "May I ask why you question me in this way, Miss Krill?" asked Sylvia, coldly. "Because I have much to say to you which no one else must hear," was the calm reply. "Dear me, how hot this fire is!" and she moved her chair so that it blocked Sylvia's way to the door. Also Miss Krill cast a glance at the window. It was not snibbed, and she made a movement as if to go to it, but restraining herself, she turned her calm, cold face to the girl. "I have much to say to you," she repeated. "Indeed," replied Sylvia, politely. "I don't think you have treated me so well that you should trouble to converse with me. Will you please to be brief? Mr. Beecot is coming at 4, and he will not be at all pleased to see you." Maud glanced at the clock. "We have an hour," she said coldly. "It is just a few minutes after 3. My business will not take long," she added, with an unpleasant smile. "What is your business?" asked Sylvia, uneasily, for she did not like the smile. "If you will sit down, I'll tell you." Miss Norman took a chair near the wall, and as far from her visitor as was possible in so small a room. Maud took from her neck a black silk handkerchief which she wore, evidently as a protection against the cold, and folding it lengthwise, laid it across her lap. Then she looked at Sylvia in a cold, critical way. "You are very pretty, my dear," she said insolently. "Did you come to tell me that?" asked the girl, firing up at the tone. "No, I came to tell you that my mother was arrested last night for the murder of our father." "Oh!" Sylvia gasped, and lay back on her chair. "She killed him, that cruel woman." "She did not," cried Maud, passionately. "My mother is perfectly innocent. That blackguard Hurd arrested her wrongfully. I overheard all the conversation he had with her, and know that he told a pack of lies. My mother did not kill our father." "My father, not yours," said Sylvia, firmly. "How dare you? Lemuel Krill was my father." "No," insisted Sylvia. "I don't know who your father was, but from your age I know that you are not." "Leave my age alone," cried the other sharply, and with an uneasy movement of her hands. "We won't discuss that, or the question of my father. We have more interesting things to talk about." "I won't talk to you at all," said Sylvia, rising. "Sit down and listen. You shall hear me. I am not going to let my mother suffer for a deed she never committed, nor am I going to let you have the money."
"It's mine." "It is not, and you shall not get it." "Paul, Mr. Beecot will assert my rights." "Will he indeed?" said the other, with a glance at the clock. "We'll see about that. There's no time to be lost. I have much to say." "Nothing that can interest me." "Oh, yes. I think you will find our conversation very interesting. I am going to be open with you, for what I tell you will never be told by you to any living soul." "If I see fit it shall," cried Sylvia in a rage. "How dare you dictate to me?" "Because I am driven into a corner. I wish to save my mother. How it is to be done I don't know. I wish to stop you getting the 5,000 a year. I know how that is to be done," ended Miss Krill, with a cruel smile and a flash of her white, hungry looking teeth. "You rat of a girl." "Leave the room." "When I please, not before. You listen to me. I'm going to tell you about the murder." "Oh," said Sylvia, turning pale, "what do you mean?" "Listen," said the other, with a taunting laugh. "You'll be white enough before I've done with you. Do you see this?" And she laid her finger on her lips. "Do you see this scar? Krill did that." Sylvia noticed that she did not speak of Krill as her father this time. "He pinned my lips together when I was a child with that opal serpent." "I know," replied Sylvia, shuddering. "It was cruel. I heard about it from the detective, and I do not wish for your sympathy. I was a girl of 15 when that was done, and I will carry the scar to my grave. Child as I was then, I vowed revenge." "On your father?" said Sylvia, contemptuously. "Krill is not my father," said Maud, changing front all at once. "He is yours, but not mine. My father is Captain Jessop. I have known this for years. Captain Jessop told me I was his daughter. My mother thought that my father was drowned at sea, and so married Krill, who was a traveller in jewellery. He and my mother rented the Red Pig at Christchurch, and for years they led an unhappy life." "Oh," gasped Sylvia, "you confess? I'll tell Paul." "You'll tell no one," retorted the other woman sharply. "Do you think I would speak so openly in order that you might tell all the world with your gabbling tongue? Yes, and I'll speak more openly still before I leave. Lady Rachel Sandal did not commit suicide, as my mother said. She was strangled, and by me." Sylvia clapped her hands to her face with a scream. "By you?" "Yes, she had a beautiful brooch. I wanted it. I was put to bed by my mother, and kept thinking of the brooch. My mother was down the stairs attending to your drunken father. I stole to Lady Rachel's room and found her asleep. I tried to take the brooch from her breast. She woke and caught at my hand. But I tore the brooch away, and before Lady Rachel could scream, I twisted the silk handkerchief she wore, which was already round her throat, tighter. I'm strong. I was always strong, even as a girl of 15. She was weak from exhaustion, so she soon died. My mother came into the room and saw what I had done. She was terrified, and made me go back to bed. Then she tied Lady Rachel by the silk handkerchief to the bedpost, so that it might be thought she had committed suicide. My mother then came back to me and took the brooch, telling me I might be hanged if it was found on me. I was afraid, being only a girl, and gave up the brooch. Then Captain Jessop raised the alarm. I and my mother went downstairs, and my mother dropped the brooch on the floor, so that it might be supposed Lady Rachel had lost it there. Captain Jessop ran out. I wanted to give the alarm and tell the neighbors that Krill had done it, for I knew then he was not my father, and I saw, moreover, how unhappy he made my mother. He caught me," said Maud, with a fierce look, "and bound a handkerchief across my mouth. I got free and screamed. Then he bound me hand and foot, and pinned my lips together with the brooch which he picked off the floor. My mother fought for me, but he knocked her down. Then he fled, and after a long time Jessop came in. He removed the brooch from my mouth and unbound me. I was put to bed, and Jessop revived my mother. Then came the inquest, and it was thought that Lady Rachel had committed suicide. But she did not," cried Maud, exultingly, and with a cruel light in her eyes. "I killed her, I." "Oh," moaned Sylvia, backing against the wall with widely opened eyes. "Don't tell me more. What horrors!" "Bah, you kitten," sneered Maud, contemptuously. "I have not half done yet. You have yet to hear how I killed Krill." Sylvia shrieked and sank back into her chair, staring with horrified eyes at the cruel face before her. "Yes," cried Maud, exultingly, "I killed him. My mother suspected me, but she never knew for certain. Listen. When Hay told me that Krill was hiding as Norman in Gwynne Street, I determined to punish him for his cruelty to me. I did not say this, but I made Hay promise to get me the brooch from Beecot. On no other condition would I marry him. I wanted the brooch to pin Krill's lips together, as he had pinned mine when I was a helpless child. But your fool of a lover would not part with the brooch. Tray, the boy, took it from Beecot's pocket when he met with the accident." "How do you know Tray?" "Because I met him at Pash's office several times when I was up. He ran errands for Pash before he became regularly employed. I saw that Tray was a devil of whom I could make use. Oh, I know Tray, and I also know Hokar the Indian, who placed the sugar on the counter. He went to the shop to kill your father at my request. I wanted revenge and the money. Hokar was saved from starvation by my good mother. He came of a race of thugs, if you know anything about them." "Oh," moaned Sylvia, covering her face again. "Ah, you do. So much the better. It will save my explaining, as there is not much time left before your fool arrives. Hokar saw that I loved to hurt living creatures, and he taught me how to strangle cats and dogs and things. No one knew but Hokar that I killed them, and it was thought he ate them, but he didn't. I strangled them because I loved to see them suffer, and because I wished to learn how to strangle in the way the thugs did." Sylvia was sick with fear and disgust. "For God's sake, don't tell me any more," she said imploringly. But she might as well have spoken to a granite rock. "You shall hear everything," said Maud, relentlessly. "I asked Hokar to strangle Krill. He went to the shop, but when he saw that Krill had only one eye, he could not offer him to the goddess Bhowanee. He came to me at Judson's hotel, after he left the sugar on the counter, and told me the goddess would not accept the offering of a maimed man. I did not know what to do. I went with my mother to Pash's office when she was arranging to prosecute Krill for bigamy. I met Tray there. He told me he had given the brooch to Pash, and then it was in the inner office. My mother was talking to Pash within, and I chatted to Tray outside. I told Tray I wanted to kill Krill, and that if he would help me, I would give him a lot of money. He agreed, for he was a boy such as I was when a girl, fond of seeing things suffer. You can't wonder at it in me," went on Mrs. Krill, coolly. "My grandmother was hanged for poisoning my grandfather, and I expect I inherit the love of murder from her." "I won't listen," cried Sylvia, shuddering. "Oh, yes, you will. I'll soon be done," went on her persecutor, cruelly. "Well, then, when I found Tray was like myself, I determined to get the brooch and hurt Krill. Hurt him as he hurt me," she cried vehemently. "Tray told me of the cellar and of the side passage. When my mother and Pash came out of the inner office and went to the door, I ran in and took the brooch. It was hidden under some papers and had escaped my mother's eyes, but I searched till I got it. Then I made an appointment with Tray for 11 o'clock at the corner of Gwynne Street. I went back to Judson's hotel, and my mother and I went to the theatre. We had supper and retired to bed. That is, my mother did. We had left the theatre early, as my mother had a headache, and I had plenty of time. Mother fell asleep almost immediately. I went downstairs veiled and in dark clothes. I slipped past the night porter and met Tray. We went by the side passage to the cellar. Thinking we were customers, Krill let us in. Tray locked the door, and I threw myself on Krill. He had not been drinking much, or I might not have mastered him. As it was, he was too terrified when he recognized me to struggle. In fact, he fainted. With Tray's assistance, I bound his hands behind his back, and then we enjoyed ourselves. She rubbed her hands together, looking more like a fiend than a woman. Sylvia rose and staggered to the door. "No more, no more!" Maud pushed her back into her chair. "Stop where you are, you whimpering fool," she snarled exultingly. "I have you safe." Then she continued quickly, with another glance at the clock, the long hand of which now pointed to 4:15. With Tray's assistance, I carried Krill up to the shop. Tray found an auger and bored a hole in the floor. Then I picked up a coil of copper wire which was being used in packing things for Krill to make his escape. I took it up. We laid Krill's neck over the hole and passed the wire round his neck and through the hole. Tray went down and tied a cross stick on the end of the wire, so that he could put his weight on it when we strangled. "Oh, great heaven!" moaned Sylvia, stopping her ears. Maud bent over her and pulled her hands away. "You shall hear, you little beast," she snarled. All the time Krill was sensible. He recovered his senses after he was bound. I prolonged his agony as much as possible. When Tray went down to see after the wire, I knelt beside Krill and told him that I knew I was not his daughter, that I intended to strangle him as I had strangled Lady Rachel. He shrieked with horror. "That was the cry you heard, you cat, which brought you downstairs. I never expected that," cried Maud, clapping her hands. "That was a treat for Krill I never intended. I stopped his crying any more for assistance by pinning his mouth together, as he had done mine over 20 years before. Then I sat beside him and taunted him. I heard the policeman pass, and the church clock strike the quarter. Then I heard footsteps, and guessed you were coming. It occurred to me to give you a treat by strangling the man before your eyes, and punish him more severely, since the brooch stopped him calling out, as it stopped me. Me!" she cried, striking her breast. "Oh, how could you? How could—" "You feeble thing," said Maud contemptuously, and patting the girl's cheek. "You would not have done it, I know. But I loved it. I loved it. That was living indeed. I went down to the cellar and fastened the door behind me. Tray was already pressing on the cross stick at the end of the wire, and laughed as he pressed. But I stopped him. I heard you and that woman enter the shop, and heard what you said. I prolonged Krill's agony, and then I pressed the wire down myself for such a time as I thought it would take to squeeze the life out of the beast. Then with Tray I locked the cellar door and left by the side passage. We dodged all the police and got into the Strand. I did not return to the hotel, but walking around with Tray all night, talking with joy," cried Maud, clapping her hands. "With joy, do you hear? When it was 8, I went to Judson's. The porter thought I had been out for an early walk. My mother—" Here Maud broke off, for Sylvia, who was staring over her shoulder out of the window, saw a form she knew well at the gate. "Paul, Paul!" she shrieked. "Come, come!" Maud whipped the black silk handkerchief round the girl's neck. "You shall never get the money," she whispered cruelly. "You shall never tell anyone what I have told you. Now I'll show you how Hokar taught me." She jerked the handkerchief tight. But Sylvia got her hand under the cruel bandage and shrieked aloud in despair. At once she heard an answering shriek. It was the voice of Deborah. Maud darted to the door and locked it. Then she returned, and flinging Sylvia down, tried again to tighten the handkerchief, her face white and fierce, her eyes glittering like a demon's. "Help! Help!" cried Sylvia, and her voice grew weaker, but she struggled and kept her hands between the handkerchief and her throat. Maud tried to drag them away fiercely. Deborah was battering frantically at the door. Paul ran round to the window. It was not locked, and Maud, struggling with Sylvia, had no time to close it. With a cry of alarm, Paul threw up the window and jumped into the room. At the same moment, Deborah, putting her sturdy shoulder to the frail door, burst it open. Beecot flung himself on the woman and dragged her back, but she clung like a leech to Sylvia with the black handkerchief in her grip. Deborah, silent and fierce, grabbed at the handkerchief and tore it from Maud's grasp. Sylvia, half strangled, fell back in a faint, white as a corpse, while Paul struggled with the savage and baffled woman. "You've killed her," shouted Deborah, and laid her strong hands on Maud. "You devil!" She shook her fiercely. "I'll kill you!" And she shook her again. Paul threw himself on his knees beside the insensible form of Sylvia, and left Deborah to deal with Maud. That creature was gasping as Mrs. Tawsey swung her to and fro. Then she began to fight, and the two women crashed round the little room, upsetting the furniture. Paul took Sylvia in his arms and shrank against the wall to protect her. A new person suddenly appeared, no less a woman than Matilda. When she saw Maud in Deborah's grip, she flew at her sister like a tigress and dragged her off. Maud was free for a moment. Seeing her chance, she scrambled out of the window and ran through the garden down the road toward the station. Perhaps she had a vague idea of escape. Deborah, exerting her great strength, threw Matilda aside, and without a cry ran out of the house and after the assassin who had tried to strangle Sylvia. Matilda, true to her salt, ran also to help Maud Krill, and the two women sped in the wake of the insane creature who was swiftly running in the direction of the station. People began to look round, a crowd gathered like magic, and in a few moments Maud was being chased by quite a mob of people. She ran like a hare. Heaven only knows if she hoped to escape after her failure to kill Sylvia, but she ran on blindly. Into the new street of Jubileetown she sped, with a roaring mob at her heels. She darted down a side thoroughfare, but Deborah gained on her silently and with a savage look in her eyes. Several policemen joined in the chase, though no one knew what the flying woman had done. Maud turned suddenly up the slope that led to the station. She gained the door, darted through it, upset the man at the barrier, and, with clenched fists, stood at bay, her back to the rails. Deborah darted forward. Maud gave a wild scream and sprang aside. Then she reeled and fell over the platform. The next moment a train came slowing into the station, and immediately the wretched woman was under the cruel wheels. When she was picked up she was dead and almost cut to pieces. Lady Rachel and Lemuel Krill were revenged. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A final explanation. Sylvia was ill for a long time after that terrible hour. Although Maud had not succeeded in strangling her, yet the black silk handkerchief left marks on her neck. Then the struggle, the shock, and the remembrance of the horrors related by the miserable woman threw her into a nervous fever, and it was many weeks before she recovered sufficiently to enjoy life. Deborah never forgave herself for having left Sylvia alone, and nursed her with a fierce tenderness which was the result of remorse. "If that wretched had killed my pretty," she said to Paul, "I'd have killed her if I was hanged for it 5 times over." "God has punished the woman," said Paul solemnly, "and a terrible death she met with, being mutilated by the wheels of the train." "Serves her right," rejoined Deborah, heartlessly. "What can you expect for good folk if wicked ones as go strangling people don't get the Lord down on 'em? Oh, Mr. Beecot," Deborah broke down into noisy tears, "the horrors that my lovely one has told me. I tried to stop her, but she would tork, which was what you might call delirious like. Such murders and gory assassins as was never heard of. I gathered something of this from what Sylvia let drop when we came back from the station," said Beecot, anxiously. "Tell me exactly what she said, Deborah." "Why, that thing as is dead, and may she rest in peace, she don't deserve to, told how she murdered Lady Rachel in my old master." "Deborah," cried Beecot, amazed, "you must be mistaken." "No, I ain't, sir. That thing gave my Lily Queen the horrors. Jest you hear, Mr. Beecot, and creeps will go up your back. Lord have mercy on us as don't know the wickedness of the world." "I think we have learned something of it lately, Mrs. Tawsey," was Paul's grim reply. "But tell me. What my poor angel Sunbeam said, I will, and if it gives you nightmares, don't blame me." And Mrs. Tawsey, in her own vigorous, ungrammatical way, related what she had heard from Sylvia. Paul was struck with horror and wanted to see Sylvia, but this Deborah would not allow. "She's sleeping like a pretty daisy," said Mrs. Tawsey, "so don't you go a disturbing her nohow. Though across my crop you may make a try, say what you like." But Paul thought better of it, thinking Sylvia had best be left in the rough, kindly hands of her old nurse. He went off to find Hurd, and related all that had taken place. The detective was equally horrified, along with Beecot, when he heard of Sylvia's danger, and set to work to prove the truth of what Maud had told the girl. He succeeded so well that within a comparatively short space of time the whole matter was made clear. Mrs. Jessop, alias Mrs. Krill, was examined. Tray was found and questioned. Matilda was made to speak out, and both Jessop and Hokar had to make clean breasts of it. The evidence thus procured proved the truth of the terrible confession made by Maud Jessop to the girl she thought to strangle. Hurd was amazed at the revelation. "Never call me a detective again," he said to Paul, "for I am an ass. I thought Jessop might be guilty, or that Hokar might have done it. I could have taken my Bible oath that Mrs. Krill strangled the man, but I never for one moment suspected that smiling young woman." "Oh," Paul shrugged his shoulders, "she was mad." "She must have been," ruminated the detective, "else she wouldn't have given herself away so completely. Whatever made her tell Miss Norman what she had done?" "Because she never thought that Sylvia would live to tell any one else. That was why she spoke, and thought to torture Sylvia, as she did, in the same way that she tortured that wretched man Lemuel. If I hadn't come earlier to Rose Cottage than usual, and if Deborah had not met me unexpectedly at the station, Sylvia certainly would have been killed. And then Maud might have escaped. She laid her plans well. It was she who induced Matilda to get her sister to come to Kensington for a chat." "But Matilda didn't know what Maud was up to." "No, Matilda never guessed that Maud was guilty of 2 murders or designed to strangle Sylvia. But Maud made use of her to get Deborah out of the house, and it was Maud who made Tray send the letter asking Mrs. Purr to come to him, so that she also might be out of the way. In fact, Maud arranged so that everyone should be away, and Sylvia alone. If she hadn't wasted time in telling her fearful story, she might have killed my poor love. Sylvia was quite exhausted with the struggle." "Well," said Hurd, "I went with the old woman to the address given in that letter which Tray got written for him. He wasn't there, however, so I might have guessed it was a do." "But have you caught him?" "Yes, in Hunter Street. He was loafing about there at night, waiting for Maud, and quite ignorant of her death. I made him tell me everything of his connection with the matter." "He's as bad a lot as that girl." "But she had some excuse, seeing her grandmother was a murderess. Tray is nothing but a wicked little imp." "Will he be hanged?" "No, I think not. His youth will be in his favour, though I'd hang him myself if I had the chance, and so put him beyond the reach of hurting any one. But I expect he'll get a long sentence." "And Mrs. Krill?" "Mrs. Jessop, you mean? I don't know. She apparently was ignorant that Maud had killed Krill, though she might have guessed it, after the way in which Lady Rachel was murdered. I dare say she'll get off. I'm going to see her shortly, and tell her of the terrible death of her daughter." Paul did not pursue the conversation. He was sick with the horror of the business, and moreover was too anxious about Sylvia's health to take much interest in the winding up of the case. That he left in the hands of Hurd, and assured him that the £1,000 reward which Mrs. Krill had offered would be paid to him by Miss Norman. Of course, Pash had known for some time that Maud was too old to have been born to Mrs. Jessop's second marriage with Krill, but he never knew that the widow had committed bigamy. He counted on keeping her under his thumb by threatening to prove that Maud was not legally entitled to the money. But when the discovery was made at Beechill and Stowley churches by Miss Quian, the monkey-faced lawyer could do nothing. Beecot could have exposed him, and for his malpractice have got him struck off the rolls, but he simply punished him by taking away Sylvia's business and giving it to Ford. That enterprising young solicitor speedily placed the monetary affairs on a proper basis, and saw that Sylvia was properly reinstated in her rights. Seeing that she was the only child and legal heiress of Krill, this was not difficult. The two women who had illegally secured possession of the money had spent a great deal in a very wasteful manner, but the dead man's investments were so excellent and judicious that Sylvia lost comparatively little, and became possessed of nearly £5,000 a year, with a prospect of her income increasing. But she was too ill to appreciate this good fortune. The case got into the papers, and everyone was astonished at the strange sequel to the Gwynne Street mystery. Beecot Senior, reading the papers, learned that Sylvia was once more an heiress, and forthwith held out an olive branch to Paul. Moreover, the frantic old gentleman, as Deborah called him, really began to feel his years, and to feel also that he had treated his only son rather harshly, so he magnanimously offered to forgive Paul on no conditions whatsoever. For the sake of his mother, the young man buried the past, and went down to be received in a stately manner by his father, and with joyful tears by his mother. Also, he was most anxious to hear details of the case which had not been made public. Paul told him everything, and Beecot Senior snorted with rage. The recital proved too much for Mrs. Beecot, who retired as usual to bed and fortified herself with sal volatile. But Paul and his respected parent sat up till late discussing the matter. "And now, sir," said Beecot Senior, grasping the stem of his wine glass as though he intended to hurl it at his son, "let us gather up the threads of this infamous case. This atrocious woman who tried to strangle your future wife. She has been buried quietly. Her mother was at the funeral, and so was the father." "A pretty pair," gobbled the turkey cock, growing red. "I suppose the government will hang the pair." "No, Captain Jessop can't be touched, as he had nothing to do with the murder, and Sylvia and myself are not going to prosecute him for attempting to get the jewels from Pash." "Then you ought to. It is a duty you owe to society." Paul shook his head. "I think it best to leave things as they are, father," he said mildly, "especially as Mrs. Jessop, much broken in health because of her daughter's terrible end, has gone back with her husband to live at his house in Stowley." "What!" shouted Beecot Senior. "Is that she devil to go free too?" "I don't think she was so bad as we thought," said Paul. "I fancied she was a thoroughly bad woman, but she really was not. She certainly committed bigamy, but then she thought Jessop was drowned. When he came to life she preferred to live with Krill, as he had more money than Jessop. And therefore Jessop, as you say, had free quarters at the Red Pig. A most immoral woman, sir, most immoral. She ought to be ducked." "Poor wretch," said Paul. "Her mind has nearly given way under the shock of her daughter's death. She loved that child, and shielded her from the consequences of killing Lady Rachel. The Sandal family don't want the case revived, especially as Maud is dead. So Mrs. Jessup, as she is now, can end her days in peace. The government decided to let her go under the circumstances." "Tush," said Beecot senior. "Sugar-coated pills and idiocy. Nothing will ever be done properly until this government goes out. And it will," striking the table with his fist, "if I have anything to do with the matter. So Mrs. Krill, or Jessup, is free to murder, and—" "She murdered no one," interposed Paul, quickly. "She knew that her daughter had killed Lady Rachel and shielded her, but she was never sure if Maud had strangled Krill, and she feared to ask her. But as the girl was out all night at the time of the murder, Mrs. Jessup, I think, knows more than she chooses to admit. However, the Treasury won't prosecute her, and her mind is now weak. Let the poor creature end her days with Jessup, father. Is there anything else you wish to know?" "That boy Tray. He was tried for being an accessory before the crime, but his counsel put forward the plea of his age, and that he had been under the influence of Maud. He has been sent to a reformatory for a good number of years. He may improve." "Huh!" grunted the old gentleman. "And silk purses may be made out of sows' ears, but not in our time, my boy. We'll hear more of that juvenile scoundrel yet. Now that blackguard Hayes. He has gone abroad, and is likely to remain abroad. Sandal and Tempest kept their word, but I think Hurd put it about that Hay was a cheat and a scoundrel. Poor Hay," sighed Paul. "He has ruined his career." "Bah, he never had one. If you pity scoundrels, Paul, what are you to think of good people? Such as Deborah, who is nursing my darling. I think she's the best woman in the world." "Except your mother?" Paul nearly fell from his seat on hearing this remark. Beecot senior certainly might have been in earnest, but his good opinion did not prevent him still continuing to worry Mrs. Beecot, which he did to the end of her life. "I suppose that Matilda Junk creature had nothing to do with the murder?" asked Beecot, after an embarrassing pause on his son's part. "No, she knew absolutely nothing, and only attacked Deborah because she fancied Deborah was attacking Maud. However, the two sisters have made it up, and Matilda has gone back to the Red Pig. She's as decent a creature as Deborah, in another way, and was absolutely ignorant of Maud's wickedness. Hurd guessed that when she spoke to him so freely at Christchurch." "And the Thug?" "Hokar? Oh, he's not really a Thug, but the descendant of one. However, they can't prove that he strangled anything beyond a few cats and dogs when he showed Maud how to use the rumal. That's the handkerchief with which Thugs strangle their victims." "I'm not absolutely ignorant," growled his father. "I know that. So this Hokar goes free?" "Yes. He would not strangle Aaron Norman because he had but one eye, and Bhowanee won't accept maimed persons. Failing him, Maud had to attend to the job herself, with the assistance of Tray." "And this detective?" "Oh, Ford, with Sylvia's sanction, has paid him the £1,000 which he shares with his sister, Aurora Quean. But for her searching at Stowley and Beech Hill, we should never have known about the marriage, you know." "No, I don't know. They're far too highly paid. The marriage would have come to light in another way. However, waste your own money if you like. It isn't mine." "Nor mine either, father," said Paul sharply. "Sylvia will keep her own fortune. I am not a man to live on my wife. I intend to take a house in town when we are married, and then I'll still continue to write." "Without the spur of poverty you'll never make a hit," grinned the old gentleman. "However, you can live wherever you please. It's no business of mine, but I demand, as your indulgent father, that you'll bring Sylvia down here at least 3 times a year. Whenever she is well, I want to see her." "I'll bring her next week," said Paul, thinking of his mother. "But Deborah must come too. She won't leave Sylvia." "The house is big enough. Bring Mrs. Tawsey also. I'm rather anxious to see her, and Sylvia will be a good companion for your mother." So matters were arranged in this way, and when Paul returned to town, he went at once to tell Sylvia of the reconciliation. He found her, propped up with pillows, seated by the fire, looking much better, although she was still thin and rather haggard. Deborah hovered around her and spoke in a cautious whisper, which was more annoying than a loud voice would have been. Sylvia flushed with joy when she saw Paul, and flushed still more when she heard the good news. "I'm so glad, darling," she said, holding Paul's hand in her thin ones. "I should not have liked our marriage to have kept you from your father." Mrs. Tawsey snorted. "He's a frantic pa," she said. "Ah, well, when I meet him, if he dares to say a word against my pretty—" "My father is quite ready to welcome her as a daughter," said Paul quickly. "And no poor one either," cried Deborah, triumphantly. "$5,000 a year, as that nice young Mr. Ford has told us, is right. Lor, my lovely queen, you'll drive in your chariot and forget Debby." "You foolish old thing," said the girl fondly. "You held me in my troubles, and you shall share in my joy." "Ah, providing I don't leave the laundry in charge of Bart and Mrs. Purr, both being infants of silliness, one with gin, and the other for weakness of brain. It is well I made Bart promise to love, honor, and obey me, Mr. Beecot, the same as you must do to my own lily flower there." "No, I am to love, honor, and obey Paul," cried Sylvia. "When?" he asked, taking her in his arms. "As soon as I can stand at the altar," she replied, blushing, whereat Deborah clapped her hands. "Weddings and weddings and weddings again," cried Mrs. Tawsey, "which my sister Matilda, being weary of her spinstering home, have made up her mind to marry the first as offers. And won't she lead him in a dance neither? Oh no, not at all." "Well, Deborah," said Beecot, "we have much to be thankful for, all of us. Let us try and show our gratitude in our lives." "Ah, well, you may say that," sighed Mrs. Tawsey, in a devout manner. "Who'd have thought things would have turned out so 'appy like indeed. But you go on with your billing, my lovely ones, and I'll get the mutton broth to put colour in my pretty's cheeks," and she bustled out. Sylvia's heart was too full to say anything. She lay in Paul's strong arms, her cheek against his. There she would remain for the rest of her life, protected from storm and tempest. And as they sat in silence, the chimes of an ancient grandfather clock, Deborah's chief treasure, rang out twice, thrice, and again. Paul laughed softly. "It's like wedding bells," he whispered, and his future wife sighed a sigh of heartfelt joy. End of Chapter 26. End of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. Recording by Richard Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas.